Welcome to Education in Focus. I'm your host, Eliana Kernodle. Terminology like critical race theory and intersectionality come up often in contemporary conversations about education. Today, we are taking a step back to discuss the background and origin of these terms. Joining me is Chalkboard News editor Brendan Clary. Brendan, what is intersectionality and how does it connect to critical race theory?
Yeah, Eliana, that's a great question. So basically, it connects in that the author of intersectionality, the person who coined the term intersectionality, she also coined the term critical race theory, which, as you might be aware, has found sort of a hotspot. I guess, like it's found itself in sort of like a political moment in the last few years, right? We've seen a lot of, and I've written about this at Chalkboard, we've seen a lot of different states, Republican lawmakers generally passing legislation that would ban these divisive topics in the classroom and other places as well. And that's usually with like in that public sector, like we're not going to take taxpayer money and put it towards something where we're teaching students about divisive topics that are related to generally like critical race theory or some of the tenets, right? Like that there are people are inherently inferior, superior to another person based on, immutable characteristics like sex or race or age, different kinds of things like that, right? And I think so those have been targeted. That there's been a lot of criticism and back and forth, and that's something that we've talked about. We've asked voters essentially, like, what do you want in the classroom? Like, it should critical race theory be mandatory? And a lot of people said, no, we don't want critical race theory to be taught in K-12 schools. And voters want there to be hard subjects like reading, science, math, those kinds of things. So there's been a lot of there's been a lot of pushback, and I think Democrats were the only ones who were in favor of that mandatory, if I remember correctly, that mandatory critical race theory curriculum basically in K-12 schools. So this is a politically charged issue, right? And there's, a lot of very vocal advocates on both sides, right? And one of the most vocal ones on behalf of critical race theory and intersectionality is the author of both of those, and that's Kimberly Crenshaw. And so she was recently at a conference, like the biggest like academic education research conference, and I think it's one of the biggest. I don't know if it is the biggest, but it's a large one. I mean, they have a lot of programming, they have a lot of stuff, and she was the keynote speaker, right? And they were talking about justice in education, and so she's leading the charge about what critical race theory means, or like how it should be thought about today. And also she's the one who started intersectionality. And so I think that she would say that those are kind of related to each other, right? That intersectionality informs the view of critical race theory. And critical race theory, if you're not familiar with that term, it's sort of hard to define, but it's basically, and that's sort of on purpose, I think, Eliana, is like that, there's sort of a malleableness to the term critical race theory. But I think generally understood, it's like, how do our institutions and societal institutions, whether governmental or otherwise, like how do they perpetuate racism, like daily racism, even like unintentionally? And so I think that it's like a view of the world that says like things are like that people are oppressed, and like what kinds of things keep them oppressed just in our daily lives, right? So I think that, you can see like, here are the effects of redlining, what kinds of things are still present today that, affect the experience of people of color, right? And how does that affect, minority students, right? And how does, like, what are they bringing with them, and maybe what kinds of barriers to success are in their way? And sort of that kind of framework and that sort of, worldview is kind of inherent in that. And so part of that, I think, is you can trace back to this idea of intersectionality, which was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw in an article that she wrote in 1989. So this was called Demarginalizing the Intersection of Race and Sex, a Black Feminist Critique of Anti-Discrimination Doctrine, Feminist Theory, and Anti-Racist Politics. And so that's the name of, it's a bit of a lengthy name for an article. But, with these academic ones, they're not looking for that like search engine optimized headline kind of thing like that. And this is back in the 1989. So, not really gunning for that either. But essentially within that piece, Kimberly Crenshaw, she was saying, we have these, specifically with that, it was geared toward like looking at anti-discrimination law, right? And so she looked at different cases, and basically these different classes were trying to file like these anti-discrimination suits and create like a class. And so I don't want to get too far into the anti-discrimination law, and I'm not an expert in that either. But basically she said, these Black women cannot represent Black men because they are women, and they can't represent all of the women in a company because there's a race barrier there. So she's basically saying that, like, because of their race and their sex, they have like sort of their own category. And then based on that, like, you can't look at, what she calls like a single axis framework. And so that you basically have to look at people in terms of all of their identifiable factors. And so that you are a Black woman means that you can be doubly oppressed, right? So that you are sort of have like and then the way that she describes it, and this was in my piece at Chalkboard News, is, you have like people kind of standing on top of each other. Like you can have different levels of oppression. So like if you're a disabled person of color who is like a sexual minority, like you'd be, very low on the bottom. And so then with people who are privileged on the top, right? So there is like this view there, which a lot of people, inherently reject and say, like, we don't buy into this at all. And those are the opponents of critical race theory. They would say, like, that is, not how, the American, experiment is supposed to work, or it's not supposed to be how it works. But so that I think is where that idea sort of stems from, right? Is that you can have, and then there's another way to describe intersectionality is like if you have somebody who's in the middle of like a four-way street, like, and you have cars coming at them, and those cars represent like discrimination based on sex and race. You can have those cars coming from all different sides, right? Or like those different kinds of based on different identity characteristics. Those can come on, and it's hard to tell, like, where is the oppression coming from, and it could be both and, right? And so that's basically what Crenshaw is saying. And, a lot of people have kind of taken in different kinds of public schools will have intersectionality on their website, and it's kind of gotten like its own sort of taken on its own life, right? With how, academics or people who are doing like equity work, how they would understand intersectionality. So it's taken on maybe a life of its own in terms of how it's used, right? And it's usually with that, like, you can stack different kinds of ideas on top of each other.
Yeah, briefly, could you tell us, how have we seen this play out, like in specific policies within schools?
Yeah, absolutely. So one example of that was at Seattle Public Schools, the Black Lives Matter at School Week. I reported on that in February, and essentially the school told principals to disperse a curriculum that had what it called identity wheels, and it had students fill out their different characteristics. And so then it was like a privilege and oppression chart, essentially. So you could chart your own privilege and chart your own oppression. And so that's really stemming from this idea of intersectionality, right? That is like a direct carryover. And, there's some concerns that maybe that violates federal state law. If teachers were to gather that and have that information collected, right? So the district has said that it will not allow teachers to collect that. So this is personal information about students, but that's like a direct overflow of that. And that's where we know of the district saying, this is something that you should do, and hand out these identity wheels. But I'm sure that happens at a lot of these other larger districts around the country.
Well, thank you for your insights on this story, Brendan. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at chalkboardnews.com.
Knowledge is power, and you deserve to know what happens in your state government. That's why the Center Square's reporting zeroes in on state authorities publishing stories that show where your money goes and who spends it. The Center Square gives power to the taxpayer by tracking politicians' use of the people's money and demanding transparency from state-run agencies. This is how the Center Square equips you, the American taxpayer, to hold your state government accountable. Sign up now for your state's Center Square newsletter at thecentersquare.com.